Yama, I'm Marlee Silva, a Gamilaroi Dunghutti woman. At 17 years old, at school one day, I was confronted by a piece of graffiti scrawled by my classmates that proclaimed Marlee Silva sniffs petrol. It was devastating. One of the worst instances of racism I'd faced in school. And that's why it's so important to me that we're having this talk tonight about who we are, all of us, as Australians.
Ahead on this program tonight, we know there are some great things about being Australian, but there are some hard truths as well. We'll be discussing our sense of humour, racism, domestic violence, and why we're still struggling to find a path towards reconciliation. You've got the questions, now let's get you some answers. Welcome to Q&A. Welcome to the program. Joining us tonight, writer and anti-violence campaigner Tarang Chawla, whose sister was killed by her partner 5 years ago. The impressive Marlee Silva, I think she'll be after my job soon. She uses social media to celebrate Indigenous women and to change the conversation about race. Also tonight, he's a comedian, a radio host, and he loves his sport, Lehmo, and Olympian and former politician Nova Peris, who won gold under the Australian flag and now wants it changed. Please make them all feel welcome. Well, the hashtags tonight are Quanda and Walking Together 2020, a conversation the ABC is having about our nation's reconciliation journey. Please play nicely online. And remember, you can stream us on iView and on YouTube. We're going to get the big picture questions later, but we're going to start as a nation because we've had a lot of questions this week from you on domestic violence, the murder of Hannah Clark and her children, and the dark shadow this scourge casts over our national character. So our first question tonight comes from Grace Donato.
My 20-year-old daughter, Adriana Donato, was murdered by her ex-boyfriend, James Stoneham, in August 2012. He wasn't coping with the breakup and kept calling my daughter, threatening to commit suicide. He was seeing a psychologist and told her he was thinking of harming someone. He told some of his mates he was going to kill Adriana. He even showed them the knife he used to stab her. Nobody told her. He eventually manipulated her to get in the car with him so they could talk. He took her to a park and he killed her. If somebody had told her she was in danger, she wouldn't have got in the car with him. How can we change the culture amongst men who think, if I can't have her, nobody else can?
And Grace, before we get the answers, I know you were nervous about coming on tonight. I spoke to you before the show. Why is it so important to you to be here on television tonight talking about this?
Because I want this to stop. There are so many women being murdered by their partners and ex-partners. My daughter had a whole life to live. She was trying to help James overcome the breakup. He never actually ever hurt her. He was always manipulating her, threatening to commit suicide. I want the nation to know that, and I want the culture amongst our men to change. You know, women have a choice to be who they want to be. And, men are trying to manipulate women like Hannah Clark as well, and many other women who have been murdered.
Tarang Chawla.
Grace, there's so few words, I think, that can give any comfort to a mother who has lost their child. And I want to thank you and applaud you on national television for the strength, the courage and the dignity and grace with which not only you've asked your question this evening, but with which you face every day. I look at you, Grace, and I see a mother not dissimilar to my own who's in the audience this evening. I see the faces of other mothers who I've met with who have lost a loved one to violence, to men's violence in particular. And the short answer is that I agree with you, unequivocally and without doubt. This is not a problem of women. This is not a problem that was Adriana's problem. It became the sad ending of her life because of another man's actions. And I think that for too long now, we've been at a stage where we've been reluctant in Australia to have that conversation. We've been reluctant to have the conversation that puts the blame squarely on the perpetrator. My younger sister, Nikki, I look at pictures of her. She was killed at 23. And I see in her the same woman that Adriana was, the same woman that Dr. Preeti Reddy in New South Wales was, the same woman that Tara Brown or Hannah Clark. These are the names of women, like you know, that we know as a community after their death. But they should still be here. And they're not here because we have a problem of men in this country, and it's endemic everywhere, but in this country who believe that women, when they exercise their fundamental human rights to be free from violence, escalate their control. If they weren't physical during the relationship, in that context of separation where most women who are impacted by domestic violence homicide are killed, they exercise that control. And so we need a fundamental shift in what it means to be a man in Australia. And rather than demonising men, I look at it as an opportunity. I look at this as an opportunity for us as a nation to say, who are we and what do we stand for? And that's where all men have a responsibility to challenge the attitudes that for too long now have seen women treated as chattels, treated as property. And all I can do for you this evening and all I can say is that I see you, Grace. I hear you and I believe you and I am so sorry.
Tarang, can I ask you though, because you're looking directly at Grace in the audience tonight. Your mother's over here in the front row, understandably in tears. Can you look at them and say, we as Australian men, we can fix this?
We have to. We have to, Hamish. I think one of the things about Australia that has sometimes helped us is that attitude of she'll be right. Sometimes we've actually been able to make things good again. But the reality of she'll be right is that she won't be. 9 women have died under violent circumstances this year. We know the name of one of those women, Hannah Clark, this year only because the media decided to cover it on the front page. And had Hannah and her 3 children not been incinerated after one of the worst bushfire seasons on record, I wonder whether Hannah's death would have made the news that it did. And even then we saw in the news reporting that the man, whose name I will not mention, that took her life was a good man who fell from grace, or an ex-NRL player. Those things are irrelevant in the context of murder. And to hear that a man who incinerated his 3 children was someone who had just snapped, that is doing a disservice to the facts, let alone what it says about the context in which this crime occurred.
Marlee, I know your dad, who was a footy player as well, he grew up in a house where there was some domestic violence. And I was surprised to learn that it had taken him a really long time to even tell you about it. Why is it so hard to talk about this stuff in Australia?
Well, it comes back to being raised in the society that tells you to be a man, you can't show these kinds of emotions. I think in part he was shielding us from the trauma of it, and also because he's talking about my grandfather who's passed, and I think he still wanted us to see him in a particular light, which, even in trauma, we still love a lot of our family members, which makes it so complicated as well. But I have been so incredibly proud of my father and what he's done in the last 5 years. And I think maybe it is a part of, the attitudes that you're talking about and the responsibility that men feel now to speak up and change this attitude is something that he's been influenced by too. He's a police officer and he joined the police force to, one, build better relationships between the Aboriginal community and the cops, but two, to really act as a protector for women and children in particular.
Now, there's a lot of Australians, including some of you, who've been impacted really deeply by the murder of Hannah Clark and her children, and there's some genuinely remarkable stories in our audience tonight. Geraldine Bilston is here. How are you doing?
Yeah, good, thank you.
I know you're also nervous about talking tonight. Just explain why these murders, impacted you so deeply.
Yeah, so I lived for many years in an abusive relationship, and I guess I've gotten somewhat used to reading about, hearing about, seeing the weekly murders of women by their current or ex-partners. But for me personally, when it's something to do with a vehicle, and if it's something to do with breaching an IVO, those ones really hit me really hard, because I honestly feel like it could have been me. And it's just by luck that I have the privilege of sitting here and telling you my story, and that I'm not a name or a nameless statistic. And I feel so deeply for everybody that's lost their life, as well as everybody that's still hurting in this crisis that we're in. And yeah, I'm really, really lucky to be here.
You shared with us some audio.
Yeah.
It's from a phone call that you made from the car.
Yeah.
And part of the discussion has been about the importance of the community finally understanding what it's like for women in these moments.
Yeah.
We're going to play a very short snippet
Sure.
of the audio. Just take a listen.
Okay, so Unit 3, number 49, true. What's happening there? Sorry, what's happening? What's happening? Sorry? You're driving in a car, are you? Okay.
Are you okay?
Yeah.
Why do you think it's so important for Australia to hear a moment like that?
That was a day after I left, and I think so many people want to ask people like me, why don't you just leave, or why don't you just, if it's that bad, leave earlier? And when the option is to stay, and at that point I had been assaulted the day before, I'd gone to the police, I had an IVO in place, and people want to ask those questions and pass those judgments on me or other victims. And when our options are leave and be faced with those situations, and all I can do is wave a piece of paper that's an IVO in the air that's supposed to protect me, that's not an appropriate answer for us, and that's not an appropriate protection for people who are trying to just be free.
And when you see a nation grappling with something like what we've all witnessed
Yes.
with these murders recently, what do you want us to know, to understand, to be able to actually stop dealing with it the way we have been and actually find a way to protect women, to protect families that are in these situations?
I guess what I want people to know is that that's something that I lived through, and I'm very, very lucky that I did live through it, and that I had the help and support that I got at that time and following on from that, and it's the privileges in my life that got me to this point and gave me my freedom. And I guess I just want people to know that everybody deserves that, and everybody deserves that whether they are with a partner that is kind and looks after them, or whether they find themselves in a relationship where that is not occurring, and they should have the right to choose to leave that person freely. And if they need help, then we have to find a way to help them.
You've been unbelievably courageous and brave and determined in wanting to talk tonight. So for everybody, please thank Geraldine Bilston. Lehmo, I want to hear from you now, because you've been a dad for a few years now.
Yeah.
And I think, like so many Australians, have really struggled to sort of take in what has happened. It's so brutal.
Yeah, absolutely. And Geraldine and Grace and Tarang, I am just so sorry for what your families have suffered through. And, you know, from my perspective, I mean, I look at my family and I think your job as a parent is to make your kids feel safe and feel loved. And I think they're the two most important things you can do for your kids. And in this instance, the opposite, the most extreme opposite happened. So when it comes to the question of what we can do now and how we can help, from my perspective, it's about calling out violent language. It's about calling out violent behaviour. It's about never accepting anyone's theory that it's anyone's fault other than the perpetrator. And for me personally, it's about being a good example to my son, like my dad was to me, and teaching him that everyone should be treated equally. He should show compassion, he should show empathy, and that violence is never ever the answer. And he's also lucky that he has a strong, independent woman as a mother as well. So we just have to be great role models in his life, and we have to raise a son that will call it out when he sees it, and never react with violence in any situation ever.
Nova, you've been a legislator. Is it possible to legislate against the things, the cultural things that are leading to these kind of events? You know, we're talking now about legislating against coercive control, possibly. Do you think that's possible?
Oh, absolutely. You know, that's what the Parliament's there for, you know, but we need good leadership. You know, what I'm hearing is, you know, we've got terrorism in our lounge rooms. And, you know, from the time that I was in Parliament from 2013, we had many inquiries into, you know, funding, the defunding of domestic and family violence. You know, the emergency that we have on our hands, the funding doesn't match it. You know, misogynistic behaviour, you know, we see that behaviour in the federal Parliament. That's our leaders, you know, these young boys that need to grow up to realise that it's not okay to physically attack a woman, let alone emotionally attack a woman, you know, let alone all the other aspects that constitute to what actually means a domestic and family violence. But, you know, I'm deeply, you know, paining for what, you know, you guys have just shared with us today. And, you know, for myself, I guess as a Aboriginal person, you know, we're talking about people having shared access to resources. You know, you look at what's happening in Western Australia, where if you're an Aboriginal woman, you're trying to flee domestic and family violence, you ring the police will do a police check on you, and they'll see you've got an outstanding fine. And I was just on the phone today to a couple of people who work in that industry, and they're like, police will say, you've got an outstanding fine. If we come there, we're not going to save you from domestic and family violence. You have to go to jail. You know, this is Australia. This is an unlucky country. We've got systemic racism. We've got systemic issues within sports and areas where women are looked down upon. You know, we've got to start lifting the women up. We're the mothers of these children that potentially become monsters and perpetrators of domestic and family violence, but they're all behaviours that are learnt. And, you know, we need good leadership on this.
Is it there? Is it there?
Not now, no. It takes someone, you know, if this is an emergency, what we're saying now, domestic and family violence, put the resources in, so a woman can be protected. You know, in Alice Springs, still to this day, where the Alice Springs domestic and family violence, that's a 30-bed. You know, you've got Aboriginal women are 84% more likely to end up in hospital because of domestic family violence, but you don't have the resources. You know, men need to have an early intervention when it comes to changing their behaviours. And we've got some great programs out there. Charlie King, you know, the program that he runs, and, you know, with the Link Up, every single footy club in the Northern Territory has a domestic and family violence action plan. This is what leadership is, but it's come from the grassroots. If you want to change behaviour, everyone needs to gel together and pull together as a community.
Right, we know this is a difficult conversation for many of you watching at home tonight, so if you or anyone you know needs help, please call Lifeline or 1800-RESPECT. Those numbers are on your screen right now. Our next question tonight comes from Georgie Dole.
As young women, how are we supposed to trust in a nation, a government and a society that celebrated and awarded Bettina Arndt, a woman who praised the comments of a Queensland police officer in the wake of the Hannah Clark tragedy?
And of course, Bettina Arndt was made a member of the Order of Australia for her service to the community. As a social commentator and to gender equity, she's always advocated strongly for men, and her latest tweet praised a Queensland police officer for keeping an open mind that Hannah Clark's killer may have been driven too far. Those were his words which she referred to. Nova, you received an Order of Australia in 1997. Are you comfortable with Bettina Arndt retaining this award?
No way. You know, like I received my award for excellence in sports. People receive, you know, those accolades for the excellence in their fields, and, you know, for a woman to actually make that commentary and gloat about it, and, you know, as far as I know, her tweet is still up there. It's horrific. You know, what she's doing is almost condoning that sort of behaviour. It's giving an excuse for that sort of behaviour. You got to call things for what it is. I mean, a monster murdered his wife and his children. It is what it is, and you've got to start calling the shots like that. And, you know, I'm glad that that police officer was stood down, and I'm glad that the Governor-General is, you know, referring, you know, all the outrage where people are saying this woman's received an Order of Australia, she should be stripped, and it's good that that action is being taken, but it's absolutely disgraceful for what she said.
Tarang, how do you and your family feel about this person holding that honour and saying things like this?
It's appalling commentary from Bettina Arndt, and she's got attention for all manner of things throughout her career. She's not a registered psychologist. You know, it needs to be said, I think, as well, that she doesn't actually hold any accreditation. I agree with everything that Nova has said. The Order of Australia is something that should be something that all Australians can have pride in. And for someone like Bettina Arndt to be awarded and condone those sorts of comments that fuel a culture of victim blaming, let's unpack that. In what world or in what Australia is a man driven too far to kill his wife and their 3 children and then be labelled a good man? And even the way we sometimes talk about it, that a monster killed his family, I'm very conscious of the word monster and it being used in this circumstance. A man murdered his partner and their children. And I think sometimes when we look at these men as monsters, we separate ourselves. You know, as a man myself, that I say, oh, I'm one of the good ones and he's over there, rather than thinking that violence is across a continuum. And this is something that women experience. I see my mother here, I see Grace here, I see Geraldine. If we know that 1 in 4 women will experience violence, there will be people watching, whether live or on iView afterwards, that have experienced violence at some point in their life. You know, and it comes down to that fundamental question of what kind of man do we want in Australia? And what kind of society and homes do we want to create for women? And so for having someone like Bettina Arndt be awarded, you know, and recognised, given her contributions, I think it's appalling.
But are you saying that it was a mistake in the first place? Because she has campaigned on some of these sorts of issues for a long time, talked about a fake rape crisis, all sorts of things like that, interviewed people in a fairly sympathetic fashion on some of these subjects. Was it a mistake to give it to her in the first place? Is that your argument?
It's my argument that it probably was a mistake to award Bettina Arndt in the first place. I think that her contribution to gender equity, advocating for men, is questionable. I think that what she does is create a gender divide more so than a cohesive society where we can actually address the needs of victim survivors. You know, we often hear when we have a conversation about women who experience violence, well, not all men commit violence, or what about men? And one of the tricks in her playbook is the "what about men" argument. It is to obfuscate the question. It is to change the subject during a conversation to something else. And I think that the Order of Australia is something that we should have pride in.
Right. I should add as well that she denies ever misrepresenting herself or her qualifications. Our next question tonight comes from Maureen Inkster.
Yes, a 14-year-old boy demonstrated exemplary behaviour last Friday in Sydney when he saw a man allegedly punching a woman in the face. He hopped off the school bus and confronted the man in question. Surely that implies that we're on the right track here in Australia, doesn't it?
Lehmo.
Good on him, I say. That's a very brave move from the young fella. I don't know that I would recommend 14-year-olds inject themselves into those situations, though, to be honest. I feel like it's smart as well to assess any risk to yourself in those situations.
But this is a question about cultural change. Are we seeing signs that maybe men are learning lessons?
To see a 14-year-old jump out of a bus like that, absolutely, is a step in the right direction. So yes, I think we are moving in the right direction 100%, and I think conversations like this certainly help us move in the right direction, and that sort of action will get called out these days. I feel confident that that sort of action anywhere in Australia will be called out.
So Marlee, do you see in your cohort, your age group, changes? Just
thinking about that, like, I was in high school not that long ago, and you know, I've been thinking a lot about International Women's Day, which is coming up, and my memories of International Women's Day as a teenager were actually my male peers complaining about not having an International Men's Day, or there was a big surge in jokes about us needing to be in the kitchen and trying to shut down discussions around that sort of stuff. I think that there remains to be this not taking it seriously kind of attitude within adolescent circles in particular, and it needs to be shut down. I think there's also violent tendencies that come up with how much our young men watch porn, and the kind of violence, sexualisation of women at a much younger age as well. I think that in general conversations, in this case with this young boy, it might just be a one-off in some instances. I just think that the bro culture and the locker room culture is very much alive and well.
What's the bro culture then?
You know, making jokes, or that's just how boys talk when they get called out. You know, like I said, I remember being told to, go make me a sandwich a lot in high school, and everyone laughs it off and no one takes it seriously. You know, at high school, it's a bit of a different ball game. But if I try and talk about women's issues with men in particular circles, men my age, they tend to still think that feminism is a very dirty word, and it's not something for them to care about either.
Okay. We're going to take a slight change in course now. Our next question tonight comes from Fiona Goody.
Is political correctness stifling Aussie fun and humour? How do you balance not offending someone in the process? Okay,
Lehmo, you're the funny man. Is political correctness stifling our ability to have a joke?
Yeah, I'll answer this in two parts. One part, the first part is no. Stand-up comedy has never been stronger in Australia. There are about to be 600 shows at the Melbourne International Comedy Festival. We've had the Perth Fringe, the Adelaide Fringe, the Brisbane Comedy Festival, the Sydney Comedy Festival. There are currently 200 plus Netflix stand-up comedy specials on Netflix. A stand-up comedian won the Gold Logie last year. There's a comedian on this panel tonight. So comedy's doing well in Australia. So PC culture hasn't stifled comedy. It may have stifled 1980s comedy, but it hasn't stifled comedy. Comedians have moved with the time. So comedy is alive and well. And comedians are a very diverse bunch these days, much more so than when I first started doing stand-up 25 years ago.
But tell me about the footy show, because you took that on as
Yes.
the host a few years ago, last year in fact.
Yes.
And you were sort of meant to make a more woke version of it.
I went into therapy to forget about this part of myself.
Well, this is a safe space for you tonight, Lehmo. You were kind of meant to make a more woke version of it. There was to be no Sam Newman running around in blackface, none of the sort of types of jokes that were on there before. How did it go?
Well, it didn't go well. I think we lasted 6 episodes, maybe. So the footy show went for 25 years and 6 episodes.
Right.
But I think the reason it didn't survive is not because of the content on the show. I actually think it's a branding issue. Because we were still called the footy show.
But do you think there is an appetite in the Australian community, though, for that sort of humour that has been on the footy show for so many years?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So I worked on a show called Before the Game, which was an AFL comedy show for years. And that was a very, very inclusive show and very popular for 11 or 12 years. The Front Bar, which is an AFL show on Channel 7 now, is also a very popular, very inclusive show. So there's definitely room for that sort of comedy. I don't think PC culture is killing that sort of comedy. I get frustrated at PC culture when, you know, I'll give you 2 examples, both at the SCG, both involving former Prime Ministers.
Okay.
Bob Hawke was at the SCG at an Ashes Test match, standing with 50 Richie Benos, and he sculled a beer. It was a glorious sight, I thought. As I watched it, I thought, what a beautiful Australian scene. The cricket, the SCG, all these Richie Benos. And then the commentary afterwards was how irresponsible him sculling a beer on television. And I thought, oh, come on. Can't we just have a bit of fun? And the other one was Malcolm Turnbull, who was at the football at the SCG, nursing his granddaughter, kissing her on the head, and he posted a picture on Facebook, and Essendon were playing the Sydney Swans in a final, and everyone lost their minds because he was holding a beer at the same time that he was nursing his granddaughter. And it was a beautiful photo of Malcolm Turnbull. And people said, oh, you can't hold a beer and nurse your daughter at the same time. Well, he was, and it was fine. But I think people look to be outraged all the time.
So Nova, are we a bit too sensitive then about some of these things?
Yeah, I guess so. But we also need to be mindful that sometimes it can be used as, I guess, a reasoning for an offensive behaviour which was meant to be offensive. And then it turns out, oh, it's just a joke anyway. You know, like there's 2 sides to it. I guess it just needs to be the context.
So isn't that the challenge for us as a community, as Australia, to figure out where the lines are? That's what seems to be the challenge.
I mean, well, that's true. I mean, but I guess if someone says, I'm offended by it, then no one else should be able to judge except for that person. I'm offended by it. So I guess if we're talking about, you know, whether it's racism or whatever it may be, if I say, you know, you are racist and I'm offended by it, quite often, 99% of the time, it'd be a white person to say, but I was only joking. I've got an Aboriginal friend. Or, you know, that old chestnut.
Yeah.
But,
how many times have you heard those lines?
Oh, numerous times, yeah.
All right, our next question tonight comes from Stephanie Isbister.
Did the Australian education system have an effect on your identity?
All right, Marlee, tell me about your time at school.
Well, you know what? I think that the most fundamental shaping of my identity happened in high school, and it's really interesting because looking back I realised that my high schooling was bookended by 2 pretty significant external events. I started Year 7 in 2008 when Kevin Rudd made the sorry speech, and in my final year of school is when Adam Goodes was in the headlines because a 13-year-old had called him a racial slur on the sideline. And in between that time, as you heard at the beginning of the show, I had peers who like to make me remember that I was very different to them and the odd one out in a lot of circumstances. My sister and I were the only 2 identifying Aboriginal students at our school for a long time, and coming from a very loud and proud Aboriginal family, we never shied away from our identity, but it meant that we got pointed out. And I actually you know, I came to the end of that schooling, and particularly the Adam Goodes moment, because I had become so strong in who I am and so confident and proud to be an Aboriginal person. And I thought that my friends around me understood that and celebrated it too. But when the good stuff happened, and in my house we were devastated for him, but proud of him as well in the way that he stood up. And as my dad was an athlete himself, I saw a lot of him in that whole situation. And then I got to school the next day and the conversation was completely different, that he was not really a man, which comes back to what we've been talking about as well, you know. And I had this bubble burst of the people that I thought supported me. And I left school without support from teachers in a lot of those instances, and feeling as though I was okay to be an Aboriginal person when it was good for them. They could parade me out at NAIDOC events and things like that. But when I needed help and I needed support, particularly when it came to racial vilification, the support just wasn't there.
Nova, what are the implications for you as an Indigenous woman coming on television and talking about race?
Wow. I guess, like, even just leading into this, the trolls that were attacking me even before I've opened my mouth on Q&A. People fear when an Aboriginal person speaks out, and it's because we are speaking out. You know, my mum, who grew up on a mission, she wasn't allowed to speak. And my grandmother and my grandfather before that were also, you know, all part of the stolen generation. They were locked up in dormitories. They weren't allowed to speak. So as an Aboriginal person growing up, and like for me at school, Australian history was just from 1770 forward. There was nothing about that. And as an Aboriginal person growing up in Darwin, you know, close to 40% of the population is Aboriginal. It's very multicultural. So I sort of didn't really get any racism as a kid growing up in the top end. But post my schooling life and then, you know, representing Australia in sport 13 years, you think, God, what have I missed? In education, the terra nullius, and you come down interstate and then the racism started, and it's like, wow, this is what it's like to be an Aboriginal person in this country. And when you're an Aboriginal person in this country and you speak out and you start calling racism out, you get attacked, because for so long this country has had this thought process. You know, racism is about inferior races, you know, whites up here, blacks down there. And that's how this country has been built. It's been built on that. So as a proud Aboriginal person coming onto this, I'm not going to be quiet. Adam Goodes isn't going to be quiet. The amount of people, Michael Long's not going to be quiet. You know, we're going to go out and be proud people because we're strong, we're resilient, we've survived, we're still here. And we'll talk about that, and we'll start calling the truth out for this country. You know, this is the country. There's two histories here. There's a pre-1770 and a post-70, and we all have to live with it.
Do you think some people... It's clear from what you've said to our team about the racism that you got, the attacks you've received before coming on Q&A tonight, that there are some people that are afraid or somehow confronted by what you might say. Why do you think that is?
It's because it's the truth. You know, this country, there's, you know, you think in 1993 was when the Eddie Mabo's High Court decision was made, that it knocked out the notion of terra nullius. So if you think everyone in this colony up until 1993 has had inherited mentally that this country belonged to no man. So it meant that our lives as Aboriginal people, you know, we were nothing. And so when people often talk about, you know, the history of this country, the history of this country is violent. You know, there's been the attempted genocide, there's been the massacres, there's been the poisoning, there's been the rapes, there's been so much, and it's horrible. The truth just gets to people and they don't want to have a bar of it. But us as Aboriginal people, we inherit that every day. If I don't acknowledge that, you know, then I'm denying everything that makes me who I am. And people say, well, you know, Australia's a great country. If you're not an Aboriginal person, it's great. You know, so from 1993, post that, we're trying to educate a nation because up until then, there was a notion of it was terra nullius, it was no man's land. We've just come here, we've made it what it is. But, you know, we as Aboriginal people, you know, our DNA is in this continent.
You found your way from sporting hero into our national parliament in a position where you could lead through some of these challenges. Why did you leave?
Like, I served a term. For me, my family needed me. You know, 2 years before, well, actually the year before I went into Parliament, my children's biological father had passed away. I, you know, used to, 20 weeks of the year I was in federal Parliament. And then, because I started to speak out about certain things, if not every day, every second day, I would just be attacked by racist trolls, mail that was sent, phone calls, you know, get back in your box, you black bitch, and all the rest of it. It was just horrific. I had death threats. The AFP were, you know, tracking down mail that was sort of sent to me. So this was what I had to endure. If you are an Aboriginal person and you challenge the status quo, you are going to be attacked. And my time in Parliament, it was like, well, I stood for something. And I sort of felt there were elements of me, what I believed in was starting to be compromised, and I couldn't compromise who I was as an Aboriginal person. You know, I still got to go back to country. You know, irrespective of whether I was a politician, I'm first and foremost an Aboriginal person. And I have inherent responsibilities, you know, to be a voice, because my mum didn't have a voice, my grandparents, no one had a voice. So I sort of feel that, you know, Malindiri McCarthy, she took over from me. She's an amazing woman. Linda Burney, there's amazing people in there. But you can still be a voice, not in that place on Capitol Hill. But my children needed me the most. Not to say I wouldn't go back one day. I sort of feel that there's unfinished business. But, you know, I didn't like that I had to compromise who I was to be a person in federal Parliament.
I don't think I've read or heard you be so honest and frank about it, so thank you very much for
Thank you.
Our next question tonight comes from Ella Alexander.
Australia is currently experiencing rapid demographic change as a result of mass immigration. Simultaneously, many of us feel as though Australian culture is being somewhat diluted as multiculturalism is pushed. Why do we insist on promoting multiculturalism when it so clearly hinders us from a unified national identity and culture?
Tarang.
It's a great question. I think that multiculturalism doesn't hinder us. I think that we also need to have a conversation about what we mean by multiculturalism. And that's to look at the dynamics of power and control and what diversity actually means. You know, we're seeing a push towards, say, for example, closing the gender pay gap and disparities in gender or other parts of diversity. You know, migrants who are coming to Australia and taking on entry-level positions, then working their way up. But they face often a ceiling. They can only advance so far. And I think one of the things that we have to look at in terms of what multiculturalism means in the Australian context is who has decision-making power, where is the power vested, and who makes the decisions that then impact everybody. If we look at the composition of Parliament, for example, there are so few women in positions of decision-making power. If we look at the context of Parliament, and I hear Nova's response before, those aspects of motherhood that are common, that are natural, that are biological, that our workplaces where decisions are made have not kept up with the fact that if we don't change the way we're doing things, if we don't advance a nuanced understanding of diversity and multiculturalism and inclusion, that we'll actually not be getting the best results for our nation.
Marlee, can I bring you in here though? Because it's not a new argument. We have heard people say many times before that if we're so focused on each individual identity or each grouping's identity, it's harder to have a broader national identity.
Yeah.
You must have heard those arguments
Yeah, well,
before.
hearing that question, to me, relies on a secure, stable and established Australian identity to begin with. And I just don't think we've ever had that. I think there's fragments of identity of what it means to be an Australian that have been derived from the Anzac spirit. You know, if you ask, admittedly, most of the time, if you ask the average white Australian, what it means to be an Australian, they'll talk about mateship and larrikinism and that stuff that comes from World War I, but we have changed so much. And I think that because of the systemic racism that we've been talking about that still exists and the unwelcomeness that migrant communities feel or all these fragments within society as well, we've never been able to talk about what we mean as a collective in the first place.
But if we're going to find a way forward, do we need to address that component of it, though? That so clearly many Australians do feel a sense of loss if we're somehow changing what we commonly share. Yeah,
I think that it's really complex because I don't think you're going to please everyone ever. I don't think in any context you kind of get that. But I think it comes back to, we talk a lot, particularly in the Aboriginal community, about truth-telling and honesty. And I think also not just about making sure that everyone has equality, but equity as well. When we can get to a level playing field and the average Australian, no matter what their cultural background is or whether they were even born here or any kinds of things like that as part of their context, hinders their ability to reach opportunities and grow and be in Parliament and be in positions of power. When we can actually all be on an equal playing field, then we can talk about that collectivism. So,
Lehmo, can you see a way forward? Can you see unifying features?
I don't think we're diluting the culture. I think a better way to express it is to say that the identity is, the culture/identity is evolving. And as a multicultural society, I believe the multiculturalism makes us stronger as a country. And I think our identity is evolving. And it started out with those ideas of mateship and resilience and egalitarianism. But it would be nice to have something, some sort of ballast in our identity. And you think about things that are uniquely Australian. What is unique to this country? And as far as I can tell, I can only think of 3 things that are uniquely Australian. Happy to be corrected online, I'm sure people will.
Welcome to Q&A.
Yeah. But 3 things, as far as I can tell, are uniquely Australian. Our flora and fauna, 1. Indigenous culture, 2. And Aussie rules football. 3. Okay? Now, so people in New South Wales and Queensland don't turn off. Let's forget about Aussie rules football for the moment. But I think it would be nice if our national identity was built around our flora and fauna and our Indigenous culture. And if you look to New Zealand, the Maori culture is at the heart of the Kiwi identity. And wouldn't it be nice if Indigenous culture was at the heart of the Australian identity?
Our next question tonight comes from Alexander Drysdale.
Thank you for the invitation. I was born in Scotland in 1936, came to Australia in 1989, and acquired my Australian citizenship on Australia Day in 1992. I refuse to acknowledge being a POM, both then and now. Scotland is my country, and Australia is my home. Why can't we all have a similar attitude? Our country is where we came from, the culture it brought with us. Australia is our home. It is where we live and work. We pay our taxes, we pay our bills, and we enjoy the fruits of our labours. It supports us as we support it, wherever we come from. And if I might add to that, the arrogance sometimes is a problem that we have with this domestic violence. Thank you.
Okay. Tarang, I mean, is there something... How do you respond to hearing that?
I find it heartwarming to hear someone of that generation speak so openly that Australia, you know, that you said Scotland is your country and Australia is your home. Well, I was born in India, but I grew up here. But for my parents who migrated here in the late 1980s, India was their country and Australia is their home. You know, my mum said as much after my sister's murder, was that after Nikita's birth in 1991, Melbourne became home. She completed her family and Melbourne became home. And so it's so heartwarming to see that, because if someone were to ask me, what is Australia? What does it look like? It looks like all of us. It looks like you, it looks like me. You know, and it is that richness of diversity and that richness of ideas and dialogue through which we will grow. But part of that involves, I think, looking back and accepting the hard truths about how this nation was founded, the modern nation of Australia, the nation state, and what that means for our Aboriginal Australians. Not just in a theoretical sense, but in a pragmatic sense, and then what are the real world outcomes of that?
Do you see binding features for all of us as a community in the way that Lehmo does?
Perhaps. I think that we are, you know, we take the nation state as an imagined community. Most of us will never meet, but we are bound by some notion of what being Australian means. And for me, that notion of being Australian means acknowledging Aboriginal Australians, which Lehmo said. I prefer cricket to Australian rules football, but that's just me. But there are certainly binding features that are present. And I think the opportunity for us as Australians is there, that rather than it being mandated through the fact that there is no ethno-cultural diversity, we have it. So that's an opportunity to learn and grow as individuals and as communities.
It's interesting that both of you point out sort of male-dominated sport as something that's a binding national identity, isn't it?
Yes, Hamish. I will say this about Aussie rules footy, though.
AFLW is fantastic.
The AFLW is fantastic, and women's sport generally in Australia has the Matildas and our Australian women's cricket team have been the two powerhouses of Australian sport over the last 3 years.
But aren't we
Hockey Roos too.
And Hockey Roos as well.
But aren't we arriving at part of the challenge for us as a country if we try to identify binding features, that the things that come up are these sort of blokish cultural marker points like footy and cricket?
But I think the footprint that women have on the Australian sporting landscape is getting bigger and bigger. And little girls everywhere now have got posters on their walls of female sports stars that they may not have had years ago. So Sam Kerr will be an inspiration for little girls everywhere, as will Ash Barty, as will Taylor Harris, and all these young female sports stars. So I think that gap about the blokey culture with sport is definitely thinning, and women's sport is absolutely catching up. And women's sport, I mean, our greatest sporting star of the last 12 months, picked between Sam Kerr and Ash Barty, but it's one of those two.
I can see you want to get in here, Nova.
No, I agree. Like, I guess I sort of feel, you know, just especially with the fire, you know, what's gone on in this country, and so many people are talking about, well, Aboriginal people have, you know, maintained this country for 50,000 years. We need to go back to the old ways. Well, you have to go back to the old ways if you want a new way. And in order to go forward, you need to know where you've come from. And this isn't, us as Aboriginal people haven't been valued. We haven't been respected. And when you value and respect us, we can go forward as a nation. And I sort of feel that with our knowledge on, you know, no one loves this country more so than Aboriginal people. You know, like, I go back to my country, my ancestors' bones are put into caves. You know, we love this country. We have our totems. The flora and fauna, they're our totems. We have to care for them. We have to maintain that. And this country would be a better country. You know, for me, with my sports, I travelled to 52 countries around the world. When you talk about this country, people wanted to know more about Aboriginal people. You know, this is something that all Australians, but you need to know, like he was saying, where you've come from. Like, this country has a rich history of 50,000 years, and I keep saying this, when you value us, when you respect us, White Australia, you don't lose your 230 years. You gain our 50,000 years of history. This is something that we all should be celebrating.
Well, our next question tonight comes from Justin Liu.
So with the recent bushfires, as you mentioned earlier, I think we all saw Australians come together as one very quickly. But I think quite shortly when we come together, it also falls apart just as quick. Last week's episode, we talked about the coronavirus, and as an Asian Australian, I think we've seen sort of a bit of resurgence in racism. So one of my questions is, how can we make sure that the community we build during times of crisis endures? And taking a step further back, can we build a community together without a crisis behind us?
Marlee.
I think that we undoubtedly, actually let me rephrase this. Because of climate change, I think we're going to be in a perpetual state of crisis to a certain extent in the years to come, and egos will have to be dropped, and you know, we're going to have to forget a lot about our ideologies and our prejudices, because banding together will be the only way we survive. And that might be a little bit catastrophic to talk like that, but I just think that this fire season has taught us that the most. It's also the silver lining that's come out of it, is to see how maybe that is one of those key Australian things that can really bind us together. That as soon as the stuff was happening, over New Year's, I was overseas and I was watching things just kind of blow up on my social media. I still live in the Sutherland Shire, south of Sydney, so towards the south coast. I knew so many people down there, and so many people just dropped everything and went down and helped. And I think it's very unique to our country. So the optimist in me thinks that, unfortunately, because of this continual crisis that will happen, people will have to move past their prejudice.
Do you see hope, Tarang, in some of the things that we've seen as a community in terms of response to the fires this summer?
Absolutely, yeah. And I want to say, in regards to coronavirus, I'm sorry for the racism that you probably do experience, but I see that there is hope in the way that we responded to the bushfire crisis. But I also echo what Marlee said earlier, that we don't have any other option. So it's a little bit depressing that it's sort of thrust upon us in that way. But we created this climate emergency that we're in collectively, globally, and we've got to find a way out. And if there is something that crisis has taught us, is that part of what we can do in Australia is band together. You know, and if we're optimistic and we're hopeful, and we set aside, as Marlee was saying, egos, and we set aside the need to be right and individualism, and learn from you know, the collectivist community cultures that have thrived on this great continent, we'll actually have a very prosperous and bright future for far more people than have one now.
Lehmo, how do we make sure that we carry all of this on beyond the moment of crisis?
We've just got to remind ourselves how much we actually care about each other. Because in a time of crisis, it takes a crisis for some reason to make people go, oh, hang on, I really care about all these people and I really want to help all these people. We have to remind ourselves when everything's going well that we actually still do, deep down, really care about people. And it shouldn't take a crisis for us to see that. And on the coronavirus, I do worry that we might, on some level, see the worst of people, given that we're seeing supermarkets getting cleaned out at the moment by people panicking. It's an overreaction in my opinion, but people panicking about the coronavirus. But people just have to remind themselves that deep down inside themselves, they do care about other people. And we saw those amazing images during the fires, incredible sacrifices by volunteers everywhere, members of the public going and helping out when they could. But also there's beautiful images of those men from the Sikh community who went out to country Victoria and were feeding volunteers out there. And I know that mosques were opened up in Sydney to house people who had nowhere to stay. So the entire community came together in a really beautiful way. So let's just remind ourselves that we do care about other people.
Do you think volunteering may be a defining Australian feature?
We're very good at it. We're very good at it, and we're a very generous people when it's required. I'm not sure how it compares to other countries, but when it comes to volunteering, Australians are fantastic.
So Nova, do you think it's possible for us to carry forward this community spirit that we've seen on display this summer in the context of the other conversations, the difficult conversations we've been having?
Oh, look, the glass is always half full for me. I'm very optimistic, and you know, irrespective of the past that we've had as a nation, you know, in order to go forward, we can't repeat the wrongs of the past, and that goes with how we care for country, how we sustain it. So we need to put practical things into place to ensure we never go back there. And with treating people, you know, as fellow human beings, you know. My great-grandfather once said, you know, at the end of the day, we walk this one country, we breathe the same air, and we all bleed one red blood, you know. And it's just about, you know, people may not ever come to grips with we're all equal, but it's about the equity. And I do believe, you know, I'm a Cyclone Tracy survivor, so I knew how much Australians pulled together to rebuild the Northern Territory, but also, you know, we had more bombs thrown on us than there were at Pearl Harbor, so I know how much this country can gel together. And, you know, it's just about respecting our indifferences and treating people equally.
You must be an optimist, because I think you said on live television you might consider returning to politics. That's all we've got time for tonight. I want to thank each of you tonight for sharing some, you know, difficult stories, very difficult stories for some of you. Tarang Chawla, Marlee Silva, Lehmo and Nova Peris. Would you please thank them all? And to you, our audience as well, thank you so much for sharing some of your stories tonight. Next week, we're live in Sydney talking about education. We're looking at the culture in schools and whether Aussie kids are getting the education they need. Join us then. Have a very good night.